Very nice to see you all, and I'm also very delighted to be here. Sandra is a beautiful city, and I'm very excited about this collaboration. And let me just remind you, I'm an applied linguist. So what you'll hear is really, I'm very excited about collaborations, but it's very, I'm not a cognitive neuroscientist, so you'll notice that. So the title of my talk is Applied Linguistics Perspective on Instructed Second Language Learning and the Role of Individual Differences. And first, what I'll be doing in this talk, it's more like giving a brief review of the interests I have. I'll be going through 3-4 studies just to show you what I've been interested in, just to give you a flavor of the methodological approaches I've been using. I won't be able to go into detail about the studies, but again, it's more about the ideas and the type of studies, type of questions I'm interested in. It's for you, the participant, and also for the colleagues here, just to give you an idea where my research interests lie. So my primary interest so far has been investigating the cognitive processes that underlie second language use and second language development. And within this larger topic, I usually adopt a cognitive interactionist perspective, and I'm interested in understanding the use and learning of second languages in instructed classroom-based contexts, and also assessment and testing situations. And the aim of this line of research is to inform second language teaching and testing practices. So here's the applied. Whatever research I do, I always have in mind what the practical implication of that research would be for language teaching in my case, or language testing. I've also done a bit of research on language assessment. Again, within these slightly smaller topics, but still quite a big topic, I've done some research on individual differences as well, and this is the area I'll be focusing on given the focus of the grant, and I'll be going through a few studies where I looked at individual differences in the context of SLA. When it comes to individual differences, what I've looked into in my previous research are cognitive abilities, aptitude, also executive control and phonological short-term memory, 2 aspects associated with working memory. The first study I'll be describing is the very first study I've done on individual differences. This was part of my PhD project, and I looked into the effectiveness of Recasts. I'll be telling you in a minute what Recasts are in case you're not familiar with this corrective feedback technique, and how the effectiveness of Recasts is influenced by working memory capacity. This is the paper which was published based on this study. So what are Recasts? Recasts are the correct reformulations of the learner's incorrectly formed utterance. So there might be a learner uttering something like this, they're talking to each other, right? So this is an incorrect utterance. And a teacher or a more advanced speaker could repeat this utterance in a correct way. They were talking to each other, okay? Why recast? Recast, what we know from second language acquisition research, is the most frequently used feedback technique, both by teachers and also by learners when they give feedback. And also, it's the most frequently used technique by mothers when children learn to use their first language. So this is something that occurs a lot, so it's worth investigating. So what I was interested in this paper is how working memory would affect the effectiveness of recasts, how second language learners actually benefit from receiving feedback, and recasts in particular. The working memory model I used for this paper was Badley's working memory model. This is the working memory model which is most often used in SLA research. Some of you might be familiar with this, just in case you're not. This model assumes 4 components: the so-called central executive, which is a supervisory system. This is responsible for complex cognitive operations such as focusing, dividing, switching attention, also updating and monitoring the information, and inhibiting processing routines. And this supervisory system supervises 2 slave systems, or 3, but 2 that are important for us: the phonological loop, which is responsible for the temporary retention and manipulation of verbal information. And when it comes to language learning, of course, this component is supposed to be crucial. And we also have the visual sketchpad here, which hasn't been explored that much in the area of second language acquisition. In my recent research, I was also looking at written modality and input processing, written language, so the visual spatial sketchpad might also play a role, and it's specialized for storing and handling visual information. Okay, so what did I do in this study? My participants were 90 English as a foreign language learners learned in elementary or intermediate classes in 3 high schools in Hungary. You might be wondering about my accent, I'm Hungarian myself. They were all native speakers of Hungarian. What did they do? What I asked them to do, these students, is to describe photos. This was a communicative task. It was in an imaginary scenario that they saw a crime, and then they have to describe all the surroundings that happened at that time. So they were exposed to a picture like this. These were all taken in New York City at the time, and so they were Hungarian learners. They found this quite exciting, and they had to produce sentences like, the person was sitting over there, a guy was pushing a pram, someone was painting, and whenever they made an error in the use of this construction, they received a recast, okay, a corrective feedback technique. I had 2 groups. One of the groups received recast, the other group didn't receive any feedback, and I was comparing who learns more, and the feedback group did better than the non-feedback group. I also had a pre-test, post-test and delayed post-test to measure learners' development, and these tests included a grammatical judgment task, a written picture description task, and 2 oral photo description tasks. And 6 months later, when actually I finished my PhD project, this wasn't part of my PhD, I realized, wow, it would be so interesting to look at individual differences, because as Kazuya mentioned, learners even within the feedback groups and non-feedback groups showed large differences in terms of how much they developed, despite the fact that they were supposed to have the same amount of initial knowledge, and also they received the same type of instruction. So I thought when it comes to recast, working memory might play a role. So I administered these learners a battery of working memory tests. I measured their phonological short-term memory. I administered a digit span test and a non-word span test, and I also had a measure of executive control, a reading span test. And here's a brief review of the results I gained. When it comes to the non-recast group, interestingly, no play for working memory was identified. But when it comes to the recast group, the groups who received feedback, what happened when it comes to their digit span and non-word span scores, those participants who had higher scores on these tests achieved greater oral gains on the oral description task. But when it comes to the reading span task, interestingly, this was associated with gains on the tests which were in the written modality, on the GJT and the written description task. So to summarize, those learners who had higher working memory capacity, verbal working memory capacity, better executive control, were found to achieve greater gains on the written test, and participants with higher phonological short-term memory showed greater gains on the oral test. One possible interpretation for this finding could be that executing functions were involved in developing explicit declarative knowledge, and maybe phonological short-term memory might be more implicated in developing proceduralization and probably implicit knowledge. Okay, so this was the very first study I conducted on working memory and individual differences, and then I continued with the role of individual differences and especially working memory. The next study I'm going to introduce is concerned with the role of captions. Okay, how working memory might affect how much we second language learners can benefit from being exposed to captioning. This is a joint study with one of my former PhD students, Min-Jin Lee, who is in Korea. She teaches at Eva Women's University. Okay, so what is captioning? I'm sure you're all familiar with this. This is a news clip which is presented in English, and then we can see the caption in the same language. So this is different from subtitles, because in subtitles you would have, let's say, English as the language of the news clip, and you might have Japanese or Korean, whatever the first language of the speaker is. So we were interested in same text and both in the written and oral modality. Our participants this time were 72 university students studying English as a second language. They were all native speakers of Korean. We had 3 groups. We had a group who were exposed to news clips where there was no captioning at all. So that was the no captions group. We had another group who received captions while listening to the news. And then we also had an enhanced captions group where you might not be able to see it in the back, but if you were a little bit closer, we have the caption here, and part of the caption is highlighted. Okay, so the target feature, the linguistic feature we were interested is highlighted for this group. And we were interested in knowing which group does better, but in addition to that, we also wanted to see whether working memory would make a difference. We had a pre-test, post-test, and delayed post-test. We had different types of tests, an oral production test, a written production test, and the receptive test. And again, we had a number of working memory measures, which I'm going to go through soon. We also used eye tracking in this study. While participants were looking at the captions, we also tracked their eye movements. In this way, we would have information about fixations, when they were looking at the screen. These little circles are fixations, and also we had some measures for the saccades, how much participants actually jump between fixations. Again, the working memory model we adopted for this research was Badley's model, but this time we also had some measures of the visual spatial sketchpad, since we were dealing with the written modality and also there was visual input involved. We had a larger battery of working memory tests this time. We had a non-word span task to measure phonological short-term memory. This was administered in Korean. And we had several measures of executive control. The backward Corsi block test was used as a measure of updating function, and this was a visual test. We had an automated operation span task to look at updating function. We had a color shape task to assess task switching ability, stop signal task to look at inhibitory control, and finally our measure of visual spatial sketchpad was the forward Corsi block test, and this measures storage in the visual mode. So what did we find? This might look like, okay, there were some interesting relationships between working memory and learner gains, and also the eye tracking indices, and indeed there were some significant relationships, but we did look at many correlations here, and only very few of those actually turned out to be significant, but these are the ones which were found to play a role. So those participants in the no captions group who had better visual spatial short-term memory showed greater gains on the oral productive test. And interestingly, no correlations emerged for the captions group without any highlighting, but for the enhanced caption group, what we found that better phonological short-term memory was associated with more fixation on the highlighted items in the captions, and also better updating function was related to more fixations, again on the highlighted items in the captions, and also greater gain scores on the receptive test. But what is interesting here, again just getting back to what Kazuya said earlier, if you look at the different instructional conditions, the relationships were different. So people with different abilities seem to benefit from various instructional conditions to differential degree. Right, so still continuing with working memory, the next study I will briefly talk about has to do with second language writing. So it's not a developmental study, it's more about what we do when we write in a second language. And within that larger topic, what we looked into was posing behavior of second language writers. Again, this is a joint project with Mingjin, who I also did a previous study with, and this time Maria Michel from the University of Groningen was also a collaborator. When it comes to writing, based on this larger topic, what we looked into was the posing behavior of second language writers. You might not have thought about this before, but now when you write in your first language or second language, you might want to think about when you pause. And my guess would be, if you're writing in your first language, probably you would tend to pause at close boundaries. But when you write in your second language, learners, the less proficient they are, the more likely they are to pause within words and within smaller units. And this has to do with, they're not just struggling with what to say, what to write, but also with language, how to formulate their ideas. So this was one of the assumptions actually we knew from first language use, but we were interested in knowing whether this would apply in second language learning or language use as well, and we were also interested in the role of working memory, and that's the aspect of the project that I will describe. So the main question we were trying to investigate here, what cognitive processes underlie second language writing behaviors, posing behaviors in particular, and what we try to do is triangulate several data sources here. Okay, because of course one of these data sources won't give us a full picture, so if we put together several approaches, not cognitive neuroscience just yet, but maybe in the future, we can get a fuller picture of the writing processes that learners engage in. So what did we do? We used introspective methods, the stimulated recall procedure. We asked learners to reflect on what they were thinking while they were writing. We also used keystroke logging. What keystroke logging does, it logs the keystrokes and mouse movements of second language writers, so we had that information as well. To make sure that we also have information what participants actually read. When they write, when we write, we also read quite a lot. We also tracked the learners' eye movements. And what is particular relevance here, we also collected some individual difference measures. Following Robert de Keyser's idea, this is one of the first researchers who argued that if we investigate individual differences, we can also deduce information about the cognitive processes in which learners engage. And indeed, as you will see, we did get some interesting information through the working memory measures. Our participants this time were 30 Mandarin Chinese, IT users of English. They were all international students at UCL, and they were postgraduate students, so they are quite high proficiency writers. So what did we do? They wrote the IELTS academic writing task. I'm not sure whether you're familiar with this test, but if you'd like to study in the UK, this is usually the proficiency test that learners would take. So this was a task that was familiar to our population. While participants were writing, we used a keystroke logging software, Input Log 6, to track their keystrokes and mouse movements. And then we had an eye checker, a Tobii X260 mobile eye checker to measure learners' eye fixations. We got a much better eye checker, but at the time this is what we had access to. We also asked students to do a typing test, because a typing ability could also influence our findings. And then 12 students were invited to participate in a stimulated recall session. After they wrote, we asked them to describe what they were thinking while they were writing. And finally, we administered, again, a relatively large working memory test to all our participants. And the measures are very similar, or almost the same, that we used in the previous study with Mingjin. Although the measures of phonological short-term memory were different, since we had Chinese learners, so we wanted to use their first language in their test. So we had a non-word span test and a digi-span test in Chinese, and the rest of the measures were the same. So we had a measure of Berger short-term memory and several measures of executive functioning. So what did we find? Again, we ran many correlations, and very few of these relationships turned out to be significant. But we did find that weaker task switching ability was associated with longer pauses between words and sentences. One way to interpret this finding could be, when you write, you have to pay attention to many things, right? You're thinking about what you're going to say. When you're a second language writer, you need to think about formulation processes. So you're switching your attention among several mechanisms. But if your ability to switch among cognitive operation is weak, probably you need to pause longer to manage these expectations, to manage these demands. So in a way, this is a logical finding. We also found that those participants who had a weaker visual short-term memory had more pauses within words. One possible way to interpret this could be, when you write in your second language, maybe you don't remember the spelling of the words, right? And when it comes to spelling, that might be associated with visual memory, how well you remember those words. These are, of course, speculative, but that's what we concluded. We also had the other measures, and it was quite interesting to triangulate the working memory measures with the keystroke logging, stimulated recall, and eye tracking measures. And again, what we learned from here, that task switching ability seems to play a role when it comes to second language writing. That was the contribution of having the working memory measures. And finally, I go quickly through a study that we finished, but the paper is still under review. It's about the role of aptitude in second language learning, and in this time we focused on task-based interaction and corrective feedback, again with one of my former PhD students, Nectaria Kotarian. There is Nectaria. She's working for UCL at the moment. So what our goals in this project were to investigate the extent to which aptitude predicts second language development when learners receive recasts, again the same type of corrective feedback technique I've talked about earlier, And in addition to this, we were also interested in investigating how task complexity might influence relationship between aptitude and second language development. I'll explain what task complexity is in a minute. This time we had Greek learners of English as a second language. They were at A2 level. This is A2 according to the Common European Framework of Reference. This means elementary to pre-intermediate learners, so much lower level of proficiency than in the previous two studies I talked about. The mean age was 12 child language learners. You might not appreciate this, but in the field of SLA, very few studies are done with children. So this is actually great that we've got a study where learners are a bit younger and they're not university students. University students are easy, right? Because we have access to them. So recruiting child language learners is a lot more difficult. But Nectaria was really persistent and she managed to do that. On my slide, this is a little bit more visible, but I'm going to tell you what's on it if you can't see it. So in terms of methodology, we had a pre-test, post-test design. And during the treatment, we had two groups. One of the groups engaged in a decision-making task, and the other group in a information transmission task. And both groups received feedback. Again, recast, these are the correct reformulations of the learners' incorrect utterances. What type of task were the learners involved in? Remember, they're 12-year-olds, so we try to come up with age-appropriate activities. What they had to do is match items, for example, a lamp, or an eraser, or a painting, to people who were interested in doing different activities. So here's the name of the persons that students received, and also some of the activities they typically do. We try to elicit the first person singular in English. That was the target construction in the study. And what they had to do in the decision-making task, based on the activities that learners or these people were interested in, they had to match, okay, if that person likes to dance, maybe that person is interested in art, so he or she might have a painting. So they had to think about how the items could be matched to the people. Under the information, when learners were involved in the information transmission task, we didn't have to do this matching. This information was given to the learners, but they still had to tell Nectaria, who was collecting the data, how what person might be associated with which item. So a task complexity manipulation had to do with reasoning demands. Under the information transmission condition, learners didn't have to reason too much, but when it comes to decision-making tasks, the learners were involved in more reasoning. So here's an example for a recast from this study. Remember, these are correct reformulations. So a student might have said something like, Sophie on Sunday, make cards. Here we've got an error. And Nectaria, the researcher, would recast this utterance such as, she makes. And then would the student, not all the time, but sometimes would incorporate that feedback, and he or she might say something like, she makes cards on Sunday, and so on. Okay, when it comes to the pre-test and post-test measures, we had an oral production test, a written production test, and an elicited imitation test. And in terms of aptitude, which is of particular relevance here, we used the so-called LAMA test, which is a test used a lot in second language acquisition research to measure aptitude, one of Kazuya's favorite tests as well. It has three components. LAMA-D, which measures the ability to recognize oral patterns. LAMA-E, which is concerned with the ability to associate sounds with symbols. And LAMA-F, which is a test of grammatical inference. And we had some complex findings. What we found that when it comes to aptitude and the LAMA-E component of aptitude, this again was associated with the ability to link sounds and symbols. We had a relationship on the elicit imitation test, only one of the tests. And when it comes to LAMA-D, the ability to recognize oral patterns, we found that actually the relationship between aptitude and second language development was, when it comes to task complexity, it did make a difference whether learners were, what sort of attitude they had. So just briefly to summarize what we found, learners who had better ability to associate sounds with symbols showed greater gains on the elicited imitation test, and those who had better ability to recognize oral patterns, just only one of the tasks on the decision-making task achieved greater gains on the oral and written production tasks. So what is important here, again, we had two different instructional conditions. There was a difference between the two tasks, and the learners benefited differentially during the two tasks, and working memory played a different role. Right, so just a quick summary of what I've talked about. I looked at 3 individual difference variables, 2 associated with working memory, and not just in my own research, but in the large area of SLA, as Kazuya already mentioned, cognitive individual differences in working memory and aptitude do seem to play a role. Only both in terms of language development and also language use. And we also found in these studies, and again this is a finding in the larger field of SLAs as well, that the extent of the influence of these individual difference variables differs across instructional conditions. And then what the important question for us, SLA researchers, and those researchers who are also interested in second language instruction is, what is the best way to match cognitive abilities with instructional treatments? So if we know a person benefits from Recasts, who has good working memory, maybe when it comes to that person, we want to give that person a lot of Recasts, and we want to, foster that type of learning. But someone might have good grammatical ability, grammatical inferencing, then that person probably will benefit from different type of instruction. But there are many variations, and it's really important and useful to know these useful variations when it comes to second language instruction. Right. Now, new directions and potential collaborations. So what are some questions that I would be interested in investigating, and hopefully we can do that together. Again, I'm an applied linguist, remember. So these might be some wide questions. I'm not sure whether they can be addressed, but probably they are. So I'm interested what would be the neurocognitive correlates of foreign language aptitude. Right now we use these aptitude tests, and many of them are not really validated, and I often feel that we're in the dark. We say this is the test that measures the ability to link sounds and symbols, but really, we're not entirely sure about these, constructs. So it would be really interesting to explore this further, and also have insights from neuroscience. What are the neurocognitive curves of working memory capacity? This is not just a question for applied linguistics, and I know there is some research on this topic, but it would be interesting to do something in relation to second language learning. Okay, what neurocognitive processes underlie successful learning through specific L2 instructional techniques, and this is what I'm most excited about. So when it comes to recast, can we actually say, can we see something that we can't tap through behavioral methods or captioning, right? So what actually happens when learners are exposed to captions or highlights in captions, more from a neurocognitive perspective. How do these relate to neurocognitive correlates of foreign language aptitude and working memory capacity? Maybe when we know how these capacities are represented in the brain, we can also see how they might be matched up with instructional conditions. And finally, are any individual difference indicators from neuroscience that might explain language learning success? So these are a lot of big questions, and I think a lifetime wouldn't be enough to address them all, but we can start. Hey, I did actually talk about 30 minutes, so we can have questions at the end, I think. So thank you very much for your attention.